we are going to start. So I would really like to start. Thank you all for being here today. Thanks a lot for coming and for being in these Fair Talk sessions. I will start by quickly introducing what is Fairbnb.coop and what is this Fair Talks format we are having. Well, as some of you already know, Fairbnb.coop is a cooperative platform that aims to reduce the negative impacts of tourism, but amplifying its positive ones in the host communities where we are present. We say that we are a community power platform because our model and our vision is based on collaboration with local communities, always from a cooperative approach where we include local communities in the governance and in a redistributed model where most of the revenues from our platform stays at a local level, to really create a positive impact in those destinations where we are present. And that's possible thanks to our network of local ambassadors and local communities. I can see some of them already here. So thanks again. And this Fair Talk program, it's a monthly talks program that wants to be a place to really shape together our collective culture as a network and as a community, and as a way to understand how to really promote a more fair model of tourism, cooperativism, and also digital platforms for a more inclusive and fair economy around the world. This session is being recorded, so you can also see it, watch it later. And I would like to ask you, I think you already did it, but keep your mics switched off till we start the debate. And well, just to start, our Fair Talk today is about how the approach to digital spaces through a feminist lens may be a way to shape fairer platforms. And to talk about this, we really have the pleasure to have Chenai Chair with us. Hi, Chenai.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi. I want to say that it's really a pleasure for us to have you today here with us. I will quickly introduce you, Chenai, so you can know more about her. She is currently exploring the digital economy, the digital innovation and its impact on Africa's social and economic growth. And she is also exploring the digital rights from a feminist perspective. She has been working on My Data Rights as an online portal mapping AI privacy and data protection from a feminist perspective. Chenai is part of the quote, This Woman Plus database of experts, where she works towards ensuring gender diversity in the media and beyond by creating a database of voices like for journalists to use it when they need an expert opinion. So we really think that her approach, her experience can be really interesting and valuable to understand how to shape more inclusive platforms and more fair platforms, and will be for sure really interesting to understand how we can create a more inclusive future also for Fairbnb. So thanks again, Chenai. I give you the word, and I'm really curious to listen more about your work. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let me share my screen. Great, I think you can all see my screen. So thank you so much for the kind words in the introduction. I must say, like I've told everybody, I'm very excited to come and talk about this issue and also just share my own ideas based on previous work that I've done, and also just reflections on my own journey as a feminist in tech by actually outright saying I'm a feminist and just really maneuvering a space where oftentimes it's difficult for one to pronounce themselves as feminist, especially if they are young, Black, and a woman. So to kick us off, right. So I start off with this quote by Sophia Umoja Noble, where she, and this was in her work on algorithms of oppression. And I think this for me was one of those profound books that I have been looking at women in ICTs for a very long time. I had been trying to understand the gender and digital divide within ICTs at that time when I started about like 8 years ago, which has now become most of the digital space. And having come across a book and read it when I was now trying to understand the world of algorithms, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, one of the things that I think stood out for me was that recognition of context, that the algorithms and the structure that we use in terms of this internet space actually are shaped by racist and sexist attitudes. And these people are actually open about them. And then, you know, we have people pushing the idea that technology is neutral, or that technology is neither neutral nor bad. It's about how it's used. We sort of absolve the technology. So for me, it is actually quite interesting from that starting point to think about what a feminist lens offers, because her work actually draws from Black feminist theory. And it was exciting to see this book that made such a huge impact around Google's platform when it comes to how it viewed Black women. Actually, one, was relatable to me, and two, raised a point that validated that on all of these platforms were not treated equally. We're not all fair on these platforms. So next slide. Yeah. So then for me, as someone with a background in trying to understand women and the internet, and then women and access to mobile phones and digital platforms, one of the key issues that I want to set up this conversation is trying to really understand what are the concerns and barriers when it comes to, and when I talk about women, I talk about all women, anyone who identifies as a woman, but also issues around sexuality. So access is a big issue, and placing this within the context of the African continent, for example. So it's still, we have a big digital divide when it comes to who has access to the internet and who doesn't. And it's more so pronounced for women in comparison to men. And actually, we still need evidence on what it means for those who identify as another on the gender spectrum, as well as gender diverse sexuality. Then you have issues that come into account around digital skills and literacy, people actually not being able to use these platforms or devices, even when they have the device, right? And then literacy, most of the content is in English, which means that if it's English or a predominant language, so if it means that if it's not in your language of understanding, you're missing out on a lot of the information and interactions possible. Then the biggest issue is around affordability. It's quite funny, you know, when we got into the pandemic and everyone was like setting up meetings on Zoom, and half the time, some of us are advocating that it's not cheap to access Zoom. It may be easier for us to connect through WhatsApp. And also that like you need a steady internet connection, which you have to pay for in order to have your video on the whole time. So that actually nuance the issues around affordability. And then you have cases around misinformation and disinformation. We saw this with as the pandemic came out, a lot of the work was trying to make sure that it wasn't cases of disinformation, but this is something that has consistently existed. And now I'll tell you, the Internet Governance Forum Best Practice Forum on Gender is actually working on gender and disinformation, really thinking about the effects that this issue of disinformation has from a gender perspective, because it really hasn't been nuanced in that way. And then online gender-based violence, right? Like as we think about the digital economy and the digital platforms, a lot of the gear is for people to have access. But what happens when you're on these platforms and misogyny and patriarchy allows for online gender-based violence to exist? And then when you're shouting from the rooftop for platforms to actually address these issues, nothing is happening, or it takes a very prominent person getting some form of attack for us to for then platforms to react to online gender-based violence. Then digital inequality online. Some people know what their rights are. Some people know how platforms work in terms of like rigging the system. My favorite way of rigging the system has always been on Twitter, where I have curated who I follow, the kind of content that I follow, so that I feel much more connected and much more in sync. But this is a kind of skill, right? It's an understanding of how the platform works. But there are other thousands of people who are joining, a lot of people who are connecting, but they don't know how this process is. So that's a case of digital inequality in terms of understanding of these spaces. And then more so, what is really a big concern for women is around not just everybody, but more so experienced at higher capacities for women and sexual minorities or sexually diverse people, is around data valence. So the increased amount of data held by smaller, big corporations who are few in numbers, but actually know so much about us. Every day I order something and I realize that I've used my Google account, which is somehow linked, which I know I used to open to Instagram. Next thing you know, I'm just seeing adverts in relation to this. And it's that knowing that there's a consistent being watched and trying to figure out, like, how do we address this issue? And this may have a much more larger impact for communities that do not want to be seen, that do not want to be known the type of content that they're looking for. And then, of course, accessibility issues. And I'm talking about people with disabilities. Not all of these platforms or the way that was set up actually allow for communities, for people with disabilities to actually engage as best as they can. And then so I did some research, fortunately, last year that was funded by Mozilla Foundation. And at that time I was a fellow. And I looked at how AI, privacy, and data protection intersect in terms of their impact that they may have on gender and sexuality. I did focus group studies. I did interviews and a survey where I was asking activists who work on gender and sexuality issues what their concerns are, especially with the age of AI. And it was really about, you know, the data access and storage. Where could one find this data? Who has the information and how it will be used? Again, surveillance came up in terms of like, who is watching me? What is the extent of privacy? And then the subsequent effects of being profiled and what information would come out in terms of like, if say, for example, you're sharing a device and you may log out, but then, you know, like the system, the information might still stay there. And then whatever comes out as a result of you being profiled may actually lead to someone having that information that you don't want them to have. Privacy breaches. I think last year South Africa had a record number of privacy breaches. This is before the Data Protection and Privacy Act had actually come into play, and they were only reported like months later if someone had picked up the issue. So already people are concerned about those privacy issues. And then with AI, it's the exclusion when it comes to automated decision making. Yes, there are some provisions about ensuring that people are not excluded, but the result is, even though race, ethnicity, or gender, sexuality are protected categories in data protection, there are proxies that can be used that allow for this information to still come up that then may lead to discrimination. And in South Africa, the big issue is often around race and gender, because the history of apartheid, placing it into context of that inequality. And then moving on to another project that I did with policy, where we were thinking about Afro-feminist data futures. And we were looking at, we also was an opportunity for us to actually, we were funded by Facebook. I always laugh about this because a lot of the feminists were like, you were funded by Facebook, how does that work? But in this work, what we actually were trying to understand were the concerns that feminists had when it came to being on platforms and having access to this internet, to the internet, and how they were organizing. A lot of it were around the ethics of data collected, the manipulation and motives within the data that's actually available. So it ended up being not just about online data, but actually just any data. Again, secure storage of data. And oftentimes in conversations of data, there is a quantitative focus. Oh, sorry, trying to, yeah. And then also shadow banning. A lot of the times feminists have found that they're often shadow banned on these platforms, and they actually don't understand how the conversation they started is not picking up traction. Trust and cultural patriarchal barriers when it comes to these platforms, because oftentimes the digital platforms are not created with the people who end up using them like from the African region. So oftentimes there's a lack of trust and also patriarchal practices in place. This was actually quite seen. I mean, I don't know if anyone's read it. I'm sure people have read it, but you know, the move from Twitter crop images, where before it was the algorithm that was being used was problematic and it was filtering out and had a particular bias against Black women. So it was on race and gender. And now that's been shifted. And I was reading the article today, and Ruman Chaudhry was saying, sometimes we have to realize that it's not everything requires an algorithm. Sometimes it requires a human making decision. And for me, that was quite that indication of a shift of recognizing patriarchal issues that are online, because they also tested for the male gaze. And then women's safety, as I've spoken about. So given this context of issues that are specific to gender and sexuality, for me, my work has often looked at understanding feminist approaches to the internet. There are quite a lot that have emerged as a result of the biggest thing, funding. Funding has now come out that actually allow champions for thinking about spaces from a feminist perspective. It's also been like the widening of scholars who actually are from very diverse backgrounds, who are able to then take on a feminist perspective in their work. And this generally realizing that we do need to smash the patriarchy, because that's the context we're in. So some of the work, just sharing some of the work, I've already shared Afrofeminist Data Futures, Data Feminism, the Design Justice Network, which takes it from a feminist perspective, Feminist Digital Futures, we actually were from Bot Populi, which they actually had a podcast session earlier this year where they were asking the same question of like, what do you imagine feminist social platforms to be? And then, of course, the Feminist AI Research Network as well, which specifically was set up to think about AI from a global South perspective. So then for me, I think to take it to the steps that introduced me to thinking about a feminist internet, to actually being in that back of the room where you would be talking about feminism and being shushed. It was Feminist Principles of the Internet. And I want to, as I am going through them, I'm going to be connecting them to thinking about like, what would a feminist digital platform look like? So this comes in the feminist imaginings. Yeah, so the background of the Feminist Principles of the Internet. This was a collective effort that was first developed, I think in 2014, or yeah, from one of the first meetings that was done. No, it was actually earlier, but the idea was trying to figure out like, how do you have principles that guide the internet, because there were a lot of conversations that were happening, but feminism wasn't being centered. So this was pulled together by the Association for Progressive Communications Women's Rights Program, brought in very diverse digital rights activists, so people who worked on gender issues, who were feminists, and then thought about like, what does it look like imagining a feminist internet? And then I think the beauty about these principles are that they are always a work in progress. They can be adapted to your specific region. Last year, they held the African women, gathering around feminist principles of the internet. So just to take you through them, there are currently about 17 principles that have been clustered to think about access, movements, economy, expression, and embodiment. And then they're actually meant to provide a framework for women and sexual minorities, for women and gender diverse people to think about, to articulate and explore issues related to technology. So this is how I'm using them in terms of thinking about like what I would imagine a feminist digital platform to look like. So the first one's around access. Like rightly, as I pointed right at the beginning, we have to start thinking about, if we're going to design a digital platform, who has access to it? And if they have access to it, is it in a way that they can enjoy, in a way that's universal, that's acceptable to them, that's affordable, open, meaningful, in that way? Because then I think the biggest challenge is designing a platform meant to address women's issues, but no one can access it because of the way that it's set up. Then information is quite important, right? So if, as one is developing a digital platform, the question becomes, can you actually have a platform that allows to support and allow for unrestricted access to information that's relevant to the people who you have designed it for. So I think it's always the question of like, you can say, I am designing a women's platform on issues around, like, say, for example, menstruation, or for people who menstruate, this is the platform that I've designed. But if you've designed it in a way that it really ends up being talking about women in terms of like women who are biologically women, and then you exclude anyone else who may menstruate, what you've just basically done is create like a platform that reduces that access to information. And then another thing that's also quite important is usage in this particular cluster. It's also about having it as a platform where championing digital platforms in a way that women and queer persons can actually design, code, and create platforms so that they can reclaim these technologies for their own use and be creative and express themselves. Oftentimes we think about usage in a way that is utilitarian, like if you don't have access to the internet, I'm going to give you a platform that allows for you then to just get access to information about education only, because we are coming from this like savior perspective. Whereas if you're designing a platform that's speaking, say, pleasure or joy or finding entertainment because that's what people need, then that's one of the issues that you have to think about in terms of like usage. And then another aspect, sorry, there we go, is movements, right? And in this instance, what we've seen is feminist movements have actually reclaimed a lot of platforms that are currently existent. And when we think about this cluster of principles, it's about really using power to build networks and social movements, participating and actually shaping the public spaces, right? And also the policies themselves. So the idea of resistance is actually challenging the norms and being critical about like what one is expected to do in on these platforms, and actually designing something that speaks more to freedom and capabilities of how you want to be seen and expressed online. And then you think about movement building. A lot of the times what we've seen is like from feminist movements is that they've identified these platforms as transformative political spaces. And I think I've thoroughly enjoyed seeing how feminist movements have connected on social media platforms, either through hashtags or have even started on social media platforms. I belong to such a digital feminist group that literally started out with a tweet. The next thing you know, we hacked the space, which is that we set up a WhatsApp group. And that has been one of those interesting learnings of realizing that we might have reclaimed a platform, which was WhatsApp, but at the same time, it's limited in the way that we can interact. And so then that raises the question of like hacking the space. And then governance is a big thing, right? If you're going to have digital platforms that are feminist, the question becomes who's actually running the show, who's making the decisions about the kind of policy questions that need to be addressed. So that also is another issue that we explore. But I just want to say that in terms of the whole idea around movement building, or in terms of like the feminist work reclaiming spaces, Lisa Nakamura has spoken about actually that it's become, that social media platforms are relying on feminists to do the work of calling out misogyny, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, but without really supporting them. So there is the concern around that emotional labor that's done whilst we're reclaiming these spaces and building our movements on these platforms that were not designed with feminists in mind. And then I think one of the like direct clusters that talks about digital platforms in the way that we're designed is thinking about economy, right? So it's important in the way that we think about designing spaces in a way where we think about the economy to actually assert our resistance as a way against corporate control. So the current structures that are designed when it comes to digital platforms that do not think about feminism from a perspective or other inequality issues, it's often that it's extracting the most that they can. So it's that digital extractivism that allows for these platforms to continue to exist. Whereas when we take on like feminist perspectives within the economy, it's really thinking about like the logic around the capitalist systems, right? Thinking about moving away from this idea of profit, privatization, and corporate control. Could there be alternative business models that allow for everybody to benefit? Could we actually have control in a way that means that like if one person that no one will end up amassing $9 billion. So that's one of the things in thinking about like fighting it back, but also that it's sustainable, because I think the biggest issue oftentimes is we end up hacking and taking over spaces because it's cheaper. It's one of the most obvious things to do, but actually building a platform from the beginning is quite important. Sorry. And then also open source, because I think the thing about open source is that we can create an experiment. And thinking about it from a perspective of technology and digital safety and security, and using open source materials that allows for transparency and actually doesn't end up gatekeeping knowledge. So that in the end, if I see a platform that asks me to pay $5 to have access to certain information that allows for me to have a major impact, that for me sends like a warning of like, so, you know, like what is that information behind closed doors? But again, I think the question is thinking about alternative business models, because at the same time, we don't want people to starve if they create spaces and if they're unfunded. And then I think another important aspect, right, is once we have feminist platforms going, once we have the design and the work, what it does allow is for us to be able to have that expression, which we've seen is often curtailed on like Facebook, on like Twitter, or on other social media platforms, or even the way that like the internet layers are designed. And being able to freely express yourself also requires that knowledge of how do you game the system. So we think about like actually creating feminist digital platforms that allow for us to amplify the work that's being done. And I think most of the times amplification is important to counter narratives and to just generally provide information about people's lived experiences that may not be supported in like mainstream media, for example, because I come from a country that criminalizes homosexuality, and oftentimes there's a pretense that there are no queer people, there's no queer community. But oftentimes when I do find that content, it's because someone is actively amplifying and they have to have their site hosted on in another place so that it's not taken down by the government. And then also just generally expression, people having that ability to have a freedom of expression on the things that they want to say, whether it's political or religious or just really just enjoying themselves. And what we've seen really is kind of like platforms such as TikTok that end up censoring people who do not fit into what is the kind of beauty that the standard that they want, or what is the kind of engagement that they want. So in this instance, it's around like creating platforms that allow for that expression. There has to be alternative means of information. And then when it comes to pornography, I think it's just recognizing it from a perspective of agency, consent, power, and labor, not it being just like, oftentimes it's seen as, you know, there's a confession of it being an issue of harmful content, or that it actually is a way in which there's sex trafficking that happens, and the issues are there. But I think what is being spoken about this in terms of expression is around that which recognizes consent, power, agency, and labor, not that which is done in a way that means to cause harm. And then the last set of principles, is I'm imagining on what a feminist digital platform would look like. Touch on the diverse experiences, and here it's thinking about consent, like people actually building up platforms that are ethical and have politics of consent into the culture, design, and even terms of service of internet platforms. There is a platform called TOSDR.org. What it actually does, it demystifies terms of services and reviews platforms' terms of service to actually say these are great or these are really bad, and they score them. And I think that's brilliant, because one of the issues is that sometimes we sign onto things that we don't understand, and platforms are doing it to optimize the base of information that they're trying to get. Privacy and data. This is what my work focused on with My Data Rights, ensuring that the platforms are created in a way that takes into account privacy as well as data protection, and recognizes that surveillance is a tool that leads to data surveillance. memory in terms of actually retaining control over our personal history on these platforms, as well as memory on the internet. So using that to actually make sure that we understand where we've come from as movements, and actually understanding the, knowing who has access to this information, and understanding on what conditions will it be permanently deleted with your consent. And then anonymity, which is often argued by governments that they don't want us to be anonymous because they want to know everything that's going on in case of terrorism and whatnot have you. But this actually enables freedom of expression. Like if you're able to just choose to not to carry on another persona and engage in your issues that you want to engage with, it does allow you for that freedom of expression. And then also thinking about children, like active participation of children within these platforms. Oftentimes we take this protectionist stance that children don't know much, so we are the adults, we make the best decisions. But I continuously get educated by my children in terms of how they navigate platforms. And every time I come across content that's geared towards children, I realize it's that thinking of there's a need to engage them in the decision-making processes that we have. And then lastly, violence, just that recognition of online violence that exists, and the need for policymakers and the private sector to actually address this, to recognize online violence and to address this. I know it's been quite a journey just trying to get governments to recognize online harassment and violence as violence, because they just thought if it's no physical violence, how can it be violence? Yeah, so then to conclude and run off my section, I think for me, as I've just walked through the feminist principles of the internet and imagined how they would be applied to digital platforms, what makes a feminist platform is really a platform that seeks to challenge the patriarchy and outright says it, right? Like it actually is like, here we and challenge the power dynamics that are existent. A platform that's actually quite open and accessible and is transparent and allows for people to have more so of a way of thinking about it from not just stakeholders, but actually shareholders, but also has alternative business models in the way that it's designed. So I conclude with some of the platforms or some of the engagement that I've seen of feminists reclaiming digital platforms. There is Hola Africa, which is one of an amazing resource, an amazing platform that really speaks to the queer community in terms of like sex conversations. Then there is Chain, which was designed by Hera Hussein as a way to respond to violence and is actually set up as a feminist platform, even all her engagements that she does. And then there's Gotio, which actually was written up as, is it a feminist platform in terms of thinking about that? And then of course, the platform Corporativism Consortium. So in this, I think all of this is really about the way in which platforms are designed to respond to issues, to be reflective, to be cooperative, to be collective, and really go against what is existence. And that's my presentation. Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Chenai. It was really inspiring, and I think you brought a lot of elements to the debate and also to ourselves. No, we are building this platform, the Fairbnb, and it really means a lot for us to really challenge ourselves in terms of some of the things you already shared. But I would like to open now the debate to listen. If you have any questions, the rest of the people or ideas to share with us and to ask also to Chenai, would be really good to listen to you. You can switch your camera on, raise your hand. So I don't know if anyone wants to say something. Otherwise, I have many questions also. But Vera, I think want to.
Jonathan, you have questions first from Liz and then from Yuka.
Okay. Sorry, because I cannot see the chat now. Once, yeah.
Liz, if you wanna, yeah,
you can jump in. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I had a question around Chenai's comments where she talked about hacking a platform and gave the example of the group that, the feminist group that she sort of initiated on WhatsApp. But you also spoke, Chenai, about the limitations of that space. And I guess my question is, once a group, a minority group has done that, do you find that that space becomes limited in terms of its efficacy, or does it sort of suit to the identity of hacking and being an outlier, if you will, in terms of how we're navigating this digital space as women?
Should I take a round of questions, or should I just respond as they come in?
No, I think it's good if you want to answer already. We can make it as an open debate. Yeah.
All right, cool. So Liz, thank you so much for your question. I think for me, what I realized, because this group has been running for over a year, is that it actually makes you realize the shortcomings of platforms that are not designed with you in mind. So then it's not an open source code where we can go in and like configure WhatsApp to then say, okay, fine, we want our group to then have these features that make it better, because then that allows for that space for that group to communicate in a way that works. And also the group grew. So, you know, it expanded and hit the 256 capacity limit of WhatsApp. Right. So then I think for me that when I was talking about hacking the space in terms of it, I think it's an initial first step in terms of organizing and getting people together within the movement. But ultimately, the solution is actually about designing other platforms, or making use of platforms that allow for you to actually then, you know, design them in the way that works best for you. And then again, that then speaks to that issue around capacity and resources, because for us, I think one suggestion came in was like, why don't we use Slack? And every time we were reviewing Slack, we were reviewing MetaMost, we were reviewing Discord, we just realized that like the limitations, there would consistently be limitations. And even though there were some of these platforms were open source and then could be configured in a way that works for us, we didn't have the capacity nor the resources. So that becomes the issue of what it means to hack a space, but then realize that it's a limitation, because then what's more important is actually about creating a space.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there are, I don't know if Liz wanted to say something before going to the next question. No? Okay. Okay, thank you. I see Duke, I don't know, Vera, if I missed someone. I see Duke had some questions. Yeah. Duke?
Yes. Well, thank you, Jonathan, for organizing today, and thank you, Chenai, for sharing all your super interesting thoughts. I come from a hotel background, and we often get a bit scared of technology, and yeah, we need to see ways to use it to our benefit. And I really appreciate the way that you humanize it, and I think this is a step that also with Fairbnb we're trying to do. And when you mentioned, sometimes we need to let go of the algorithm and make human decision, I think that really applies to us at Fairbnb, in welcoming hosts onto our platform. And I really think it's a good moment to have this discussion and these enlightenments to know, how we can make our platform as welcoming as possible and connecting even with, passionate developers and bust out, those groups of WhatsApp of passionate people helping each other. So I wanted to thank you very much for contributing to, helping, inspiring us. So not too much a question, but a comment. And I think we still have so much to learn that I'm a bit overwhelmed, but I think, great people, and I hope our developers are also listening in, and we can be motivated to bring it along.
Thank you.
Thank you, Duque. And also thank you. It was not just me organizing it, but a whole team. So I want to thank you also then. Also Vera is here, Dome. Well, I don't know if there is any other question or comment. I see Trevor there.
Hi.
Hi, Trevor.
It's let me see how I phrase this. So we talk a lot with people who start digital platforms, right? This morning I had a message here from fishermen in Mexico who start a small-scale fisher platform co-op for Latin America, or we talked with quail farmers in Indonesia who start a platform cooperative. So I just wonder, like, listening to your talk, like, you know, what can we, or even the platform co-op that started in Cape Town for domestic workers. And I wonder, just like sort of in these conversations, like, how would you suggest guiding people to, you know, consider these like concrete points that you made in your really amazing talk? So first of all, I should have said thank you, really brilliant. I just took notes the entire time. But sort of like more on, I guess, you know, I come from a quite practical perspective. So how do you put this into practice when working with communities that already are, you know, that haven't really convened with the feminist agenda, but really that we want to sort of steer in that direction, I guess. It's a difficult question, I guess. I don't know, maybe a bit general too, but.
No, I consider it the $1 million question. And I consider it the $1 million question because, again, Trevor, like I'd said, like when I first started my work as a feminist in tech, no one was engaging a feminist in tech. And a lot of people would rather engage, like, you know, gender activists who looked at issues from a binary perspective, and I'm grateful for the work that they've done. But you know, to respond to like, how do you get people to see the value of something? I think it's always just about like that, like Duke already said, making it human. So demystifying a lot. I think there's a need to demystify a lot of what feminism means in terms of like its application. So the work around demystifying, it's also thinking about it in terms of like those practical examples that may not necessarily have used the word feminism, but then the principles are something that actually do come out in it. And then I think for feminists who do work in tech, who work in policy, is to actually then create that space for conversation, to then actually indicate that like we've been talking about design that is gender transformative. But guess what? Your platform that you've actually designed that really tries to simplify terms of service that people designs speaks to our principles. So then there's that practicality to actually just so that you've been thinking about it, but then this is what feminism takes it to another level. And I think it's also just really understanding on like what the tenets of feminism allow for. It's really about shifting power and systems and, you know, breaking down the issues of patriarchy that do not benefit everyone, men or women. So I think most of the times what we've seen is that like the moment people, especially on like social media platforms, the moment someone says feminism, the first thing that everybody does is begin to take out like assaults and taunts, especially for African feminists. But the work that usually is done, I'll give you the example of when Nigeria was having its, I think it was like Nigerian Lives Matter last year, and the people who were actually at the forefront of leading the funding, the legal support, the coordination on the issues that were happening were actually feminists. And it was that because they coordinated on themselves and collaborated and then worked with everybody who was there, knowing fully well that they existed in a society that, you know, once this was over would always come back and attack them. But then I think in that instance, it was about taking on, you know, like principles of around collaboration, collectivism, being transparent. They really reported every single cent that they got, but they also got buy-in from like, you know, like Beyonce, which was quite big because it's basically a celebrity that everybody knows, and then they support that, and it kind of like breaks that barrier. It's not a long-lasting term to get that kind of endorsement, but then the reality is that for people to actually see some of these principles as something that can be applied to their work, it's really making it relatable, demystifying it, humanizing it, and finding other champions and points of connection to actually see that the work can be done. It's not as difficult.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have 10 minutes left. I don't know if there is any other question. Otherwise, I have one also, but I would prefer to listen to you before. I think, Vera, you wanted to ask something, right?
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Jonathan. I do have also a practical question, which is a bit perhaps the mirror one of Trevor's. Thinking of a platform like Fairbnb that comes from at least democratic principles and a strong will to do things in a different way, but has been, because of its history, founded in the North, and whose developers are mostly white men from the North, and knowing the ambition for the Fairbnb project to not be only a European one, how, especially thinking, for example, the case of Africa is the one that you're the most familiar with, how would platforms like your Fairbnb would want or should approach starting their activity in the global South? What are the kind of guiding principles or key questions that should lead the way? Thanks.
So I'll set it up as questions, because I think it's always important to ask yourself questions that allow for you then to figure out like where you're going to draw your guidance from. So I think for me, it's really like understanding the value of Fairbnb.coop within the African continent, right? Like what are the practices that are already existent on the continent that are linked to the work that you're doing, and then how do you add on value yourselves as Fairbnb to the work that's already there? Because I think most times what happens is that like when someone has a great idea, but a great idea is developed in a completely different region and context and a completely different looking person, there's often a transplant of idea without adapting and then saying it failed because people simply couldn't see how great our vision was, without actually realizing that perhaps your vision had already been executed in other ways, but then you just couldn't have access to that. So that's the first question. And the second question is reflecting on what privilege that would Fairbnb hold as if it wants to then engage with this particular market. And rightly so, I think speaking to the technical community within the African region, one of the first things that they often point out is that sometimes it's easier for a company fronted by a white male to have access to policymakers, regulators, and business spaces than it is for someone who actually is Black and has been in existence for a long time. And even when there is a policy around like there should be fair representation. There was a talk that was done last year by Mozilla on like capital, I think it was capital so white or tech so white, where in essence you would find that it would be the 2 Black people out of a team of 10 who would be put at the front, who would be engaging, but the design was actually happening, again, global North, white person, without transference of knowledge. So that's the second question of like, what privilege do I hold as I enter into this space? And I think the third question to always ask yourself is then like, how would we ensure a learning space? And I think this is the collective or collaboration model in terms of like, sure, Fairbnb may succeed from where it's coming from, but what are the lessons that they can learn when they try to set up within the African region, if that is something that they want to do? And so then does it allow for that space that actually can allow for peer-to-peer learning? Because again, it's about recognizing the power dynamics that may exist as you come in with a company that's successful, a model that seems to work, and then other people are like, okay, I'm curious, I just really want to learn to see if it could work for us. But then there's that needing to understand that power dynamic. And then I guess, the question is always around like legal and policy issues and thinking about other players that are already involved. Oftentimes what I found is that tech companies want to move fast on something, especially if they think they've identified an issue without really doing like a risk assessment or the due diligence. So the question really is kind of like, what kind of environment are we getting into, the policy, the legal, and the political environment itself? And I think that's always one of those things that is important to ask. And I think the last one, because I recognize time is also out, is just kind of like, how will your idea shift the ecosystem? What is the kind of impact that would happen? Would there be harm or would there be opportunity? And if there's going to be harm or opportunity, who is the person who's going to be affected the most? And what is the work that needs to be done? So yeah, those are some of the ideas that I actually have in terms of like, what it would look like if Fairbnb was to then expand and like engage with the African continent.
Okay, wow, thank you very much, Chenai. I think, well, we are almost running out of time, so I think it's moment to start closing. I don't know if there is a quick last question. Otherwise, we can close.
I think I saw Dima's
Dima, okay.
hand raised.
Okay.
If it's okay, I'd like to ask a question about just sort of protecting users, because it seems that when it's a platform, any kind of platform that's like a social platform, bound to get hurt. Everybody has sort of their own point of view, and eventually somebody's gonna get hurt. Mm-hmm. So what role sort of, who decides, you know, kind of maybe how do you go about protecting users on these platforms? Is it just sort of a free for all, or how does one go about monitoring? I mean, this is an issue that huge sites have, such as Facebook, Instagram. All these sites have this problem. One of the things is, for example, Facebook maybe has a lot of control in America because a lot of their employees speak English, but they don't have control. They have very few employees, and then a lot of things go haywire in these countries where they have such little control. So sort of I'm asking, what role do we have in this issue?
Thanks, Dima. So I think that then speaks into what brings in the 2 points around governance and privacy and data. I think then this is the question of like how you design the governance model around issues of data in order to have that control or oversight role, and then who's involved as part of that process of design, right? Because you want to ensure safety, but oftentimes safety is designed in the image of the person who is actually writing up the protocol and the legislation and what have you. It may not be participatory. So what I've seen as some good examples of thinking about like ensuring governance is either building it up, you know, taking tenets around like transparency in the governance model in terms of like how you decide to set up some safety oversights and security protocols, thinking about the way in which who's involved in the design of the governance system. And then I think for me, if it's about safety for users, involve the users, right? Set it up in a way that they can actually understand the language. Because I think with Facebook, it's not necessarily that they don't have enough people working on a specific region or what have you. It's a prioritization of issues. The prioritization of issues of like, what are the ones that allow for us to have, you know, like better political push or better political power or better economic gain, and you know, like what's the market size that we're going to have an effect on? Do we really need to engage in this? But what's actually quite surprising is you'll find that like in those countries that they don't have big teams, they're actually very active in policy decision-making spaces because they have individuals who are very connected to these people. But it's not transparent unless you are in that circle of knowledge of policy spaces. Mm-hmm. So then I think that for me is when you're thinking about safety, it's in the design. And the design is thinking about who is part of the process, how are you thinking about the governance, and how do you make sure that it's transparent, and what are the key principles that you're really taking into account when it comes to safety and security on your platforms. And actually really making the language easy for your users to understand so that they know what safety parameters are. Because if you use some big legal term and then someone says, but I don't understand, I think it's also a gimmick of using legalese language that then gets people tied up in things they don't understand. But if you're a platform committed to social change and thinking about it in a collective and collaborative way, you find language or ways of communicating, whether it be art or infographics, so that people actually understand what are the safety protocols in place.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Domenico, I think we can start closing the session.
I think, yeah, Jonathan maybe has some problem with the micro. So amazing session. I was thinking before when Jonathan said if someone has a simple question, I was saying maybe there is not a way to have a simple question here. So so thanks for your time. Jonathan, you are still there, so maybe we close up.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I would just take a family picture before leaving, if it's okay for you all. So yeah, switch your, well, you are all there. So 1, 2, 3. I think Domenico is taking the picture. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks again, Chenai, for this very inspiring session. I really hope we will have a chance to continue with these discussions. And yeah, thanks again. We will share the video later and hope to see you all in future sessions. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.